Hey guys, welcome back. Robocraft early access coverage. This is episode 80. I'm Enigmius, and today, bye-bye Manta. That's right, the original SMG Copter design didn't work. And it's not necessarily surprising. We could have basically guessed from the flimsiness of the chassis, the single layer construction underneath the bot, that things weren't necessarily going to work as we might have liked them to. But it was an opportunity to field some rotor blades into some, in a match or two or four, and get a feel for how things were going to perform, and then take some of those lessons with regards to the copter blades themselves, how well the platform works with SMGs, etc., and hopefully come back with something that's a little bit more robust and a little bit more capable of contributing to the success of our team. So you can see one of the first things that we're doing is we're building around the cockpit in a much more robust fashion than what we had in the original design, because it's kind of necessary. If we want to be able to poke a little bit of fun at balloons, we can't be one ourselves. So that's kind of, the reasoning behind it. One of many reasons to build around the cockpit to make it a little bit stronger than the original had it. And that's what we're doing. So you can see here we're getting some layers underneath the cockpit that you'd have to go through before you can get directly to the cockpit. We're doing our best to keep the blocks underneath the pilot seat detached from the rest of whatever might be going on around it. And generally speaking, doing what we tend to do with our cockpits, which is make them as strong as we can within reason, build some extra blocks around them to absorb extra damage, etc. And then once that's done, then we can take a look at the mountings for the rotor blades. We've obviously got the Tier 10 rotor blade, and I'd originally kind of started to look at this as, what if we could make sort of like the ejection seat that's so popular amongst some builds. And realistically speaking, it's not necessarily the best idea when I see them in the sense of it's basically a pilot seat and a thruster, so you can flip yourself around the map for eternity, and you're so tiny and fast that really no one can ever destroy you. I don't necessarily have anything against those in the sense of, trying to label them exploits or cheating or, whatever. It's not my thing. But in this sense, I decided if we find ourselves in a position where all the outriggers holding everything else were shot off, would we be able to get back to a medic in order to kind of, hopefully get us back into the fight? Realistically, the answer is no, because we're still relying on this giant Tier 10 rotor blade to do the carrying. And then I wanted to put some thrusters on to hopefully make it a faster process. But for one, I think mounted in that location, they would probably just have us doing backflips all over the damn place. And two, how long is it going to be if we were taking enough fire to lose all the outriggers? How long is it going to be before they take off that rotor blade? So not my best thinking, but sometimes it's fun to goof around when you're building, and that's definitely qualifies as goofing around. Now this is the first two outriggers going into place for the rotor blades, and just kind of getting a feel for how long they have to be, the size of them, in order to get the rotor blades mounted. And then we can go from there and kind of look at them and say, okay, well, what can we do to protect them? Is it possible to protect them, or are they just going to be kind of problematic right the way through? We found out that they're a little bit too high, the way that they're built, in order to fit the rotors in there and not collide with the Tier 10 rotor. So we built down a little bit and still found that they're colliding with the Tier 10 rotor. So rather than trying to push them down another row, it's easier to go in and raise the Tier 10 rotor up a block. So it's a little bit of a compromise there, and that's okay. It's not necessarily that big of a deal, but it was one of those things, the decisions that you make when you realize that you needed way more space than you originally anticipated. So you can see that once they go into place, they're in not a bad position. And now we'll build around this Tier 10 rotor just a little bit. And again, people aren't going to be removing the rotor by shooting the blocks that the rotor is sitting on for the most part. They're going to be removing it by shooting the rotor because it's just so damn big. But we still want to protect it to a certain extent from the occasional rail shot that's going to go this way or that way, or plasma splash or something like that, by building around it a bit. At least that way we can say we tried. We made a reasonable effort to armor the components instead of just leaving them exposed for the world to do what they will with. And in that case, a little bit of extra protection, not only around the blocks, but also making it a little bit harder to shoot up and hit the base of the rotor. Not necessarily a horrible idea. Not very pretty, at this point, mind you, but it's not necessarily a horrible idea. So now we've basically done with the Tier 10 rotor for now. We can worry about getting the outriggers on for the 2 more Tier 6 rotors out to the front, and basically just looking to duplicate the shape that we made for the ones that are mounted on the back. Realizing now, of course, that we have to move the thrusters. They're not exactly integral to the design anyways, but I so wanted the thrusters that I couldn't accept that I had to remove them altogether at this point if I wanted to get the rotors on in, you know, a relatively symmetrical fashion with the ones on the back, which was basically necessary when you're talking about rotors because they're so big. There has to be a measure of symmetry when you're dealing with even numbers of them. So in this case, bye-bye thrusters. Very sad. Doing what we can with what we've got. Once we get all of the rotors on, then we can kind of take a look at how everything is fitting together in terms of the shape of the bot, where the weak points, the glaring weak points are, and what we can do to protect things. And again, I know I'm harping on this, but understanding that there's only so much merit in protecting the blocks that are holding the rotor blades, because it's not going to be those blocks that are taking the rotor blades, it's going to be hitting the rotor blades directly. So I've got one more Tier 6 rotor blade to put on, and then that will match what we had on the Manta in terms of quantity for the Tier 6 rotors. We'll keep the lift that we're kind of counting on, and we'll basically keep that redundancy, which is the goal, so we can afford to lose 1 or 2 rotor blades and not basically go crashing to the ground. Now, this is not a strong outrigger by any stretch of the imagination. This is basically like the eye stock that we're always, you know, poking a little fun at when they're made out of cubes, in the sense that it's one block. All you have to destroy is one block and the chain is broken and the rest go off. But this is just the preliminary. Now you can see we're building it out a little bit so that we can actually afford to soak a few hits, hopefully, before the whole thing goes flying off. And in this case, also making an effort to not just have, you know, something that looks like it's forcing damage around, but is actually just one homogeneous blob. Just, you know what I mean? It's kind of misleading in the way it looks, but in this sense, the damage has to flow a certain way. You can't, it's not just going to be able to go straight back or straight up or anything like that. It's going to have to flow a certain way in order to remove this whole outrigger, and there's going to be a number of blocks in the way, so that hopefully this isn't going to be one of the first things to get popped off in any match as soon as someone trains an SMG in our direction. So now with the outrigger basically built out, we have to try and get the rotor to fit, which is always easier said than done. I'm finding this is where it is now, where you can see that it's not fitting, is where I wanted it to fit, and then it would have all been nice and tidy and everything would have been quite happy, but we had to raise it a block. So now, just like we had to do with the Tier 10 rotor, we have to build around it, having just raised it a block. Not necessarily difficult, but it does kind of create an aesthetic challenge in terms of trying to make it look half decent. And then I got to realizing that I don't necessarily mind if this thing looks gnarly, as long as it looks badass at the same time. It's kind of like, I don't know if you ever watched like the early Rambo movies where they have the Soviet Hind helicopters that have like these massive outriggers on the sides that have like guns and rockets and missiles and small houses for the pilots to live in when they're not shooting at Rambo. Like this massive, very intimidating kind of thing to see come flying around the corner. If our bot ends up kind of inspiring that kind of response, then we're not too poorly off, I think. We'll be okay. So you can see now this rear outrigger is just a monstrosity. It's just massive. It's got all kinds of different connections and things going this way and that. We can call that pretty much done at this point. We can do some aesthetic tweaking later on if we want to, but for the time being, structurally, I'm happy with it. So now we're looking at basically outriggers to protect the outriggers. What I really want are like armored outriggers that extend underneath the outriggers holding the rotor blades that are not attached to them, and you can see it's attached at the very end. We're going to fix that momentarily, don't worry. We don't want it attached. We want it so that we can take some hits to these big fat armored outriggers before the shots start going to the outriggers that the rotor blades are on, because otherwise we're just looking at, again, a 2 block wide collection of blocks that are holding these very important components. And by extending the chassis in that kind of direction, it's not just the ease of hitting the rotor blades themselves, but the ease of destroying those connections with these little flimsy outriggers. So we really want to take certain steps to protect them and not just leave them as they are, because we know before we even go into our first match that they're going to be problematic if we don't. So you can see it's not really difficult to build them out like this, and then we can build underneath them, still using the same armor core principles, rotating the prisms around so that there's only a certain amount of contact between this one and that one. Bada boom, bada bing. It's not too bad. So I was actually pretty happy with the way those turned out. And so the last thing we want to do is go around at this point and put some blocks around the mounting block for the rotor. Just because if we don't, and we're seeing that that's kind of the parts that are getting shot off, we had an opportunity to do something about it while I was in the garage, and we chose not to take it, and that's how we ended up with the first Manta to begin with. We were looking at all these things saying, yeah, probably not going to work, and they didn't, which, referencing what I said when we were building it, sometimes you don't know until you try. That doesn't mean that in the future we don't try things that look like they might be a problem. It's just there's nothing wrong with being honest with ourselves, saying we saw that, we knew it was going to be a problem, and we went with it anyway, and it was a problem. We don't have to defend our choice to go in and try and make it look like a success that it wasn't. It looked like a problem, and it was. So we're changing it. Now you can see, very, very easy. You can rotate very quickly and then stop and then go the other direction, much easier than we had with the original build with the rotors on the Manta. We've got the armor underneath, the outriggers on the back, plus that center outrigger. Now we just have to do the outriggers on the front and mount the guns, and we should be in pretty good shape for a pretty badass looking little bot that's going to have a lot of guns on it, and hopefully be a little bit more survivable than the Manta was, because it's going to have the important parts are being protected more. And you can see we've got gaps where we used to have blocks with the Manta, that great big sheet. There were a lot of blocks there that weren't necessarily serving a useful purpose other than to soak shots that would have been just as, happily allowed to pass right through and not hit anything at all. So here we're kind of looking at how to mount the outriggers on the front, because it's a little bit different than the layout in the back. But once we get it started, it'll be pretty easy to carry on from there. And again, we just want to kind of take our time when we're building these initial connections and be thinking in terms of how many actual blocks are connecting to what, and can we connect more? Because if we rush at this point and end up with this thing that looks big and beefy, but it's actually got one little spot where it only connects one block to the rest of the chassis, it's problematic, and we don't want that. For the amount of time that we're investing in trying to build these things out to make them work properly, we definitely don't want to be selling ourselves short. So here, just like it's basically the exact same design now. Once we got a place to mount these two, it's the same thing that we were using on the rear rotor blades. And then we can kind of go around here. I just decided to stop for whatever reason and build out a little bit around the cockpit. And again, it's as much making sure that things that hit us, like the stray shots that hit us, have some place to travel through before they go to the important parts. And it's also, we don't want people to be able to see very clearly where the pilot seat is. It doesn't matter if they can guess, intelligently where the pilot seat might be. We don't want to show them for anyone to see this is exactly where it is. That's just making it a little too easy. So we'll build around it a little bit. It'll offer a little bit of extra protection, but it'll also kind of obscure it so that people have to do a little bit of guesswork before they can decide where they want to shoot, if they're going right for the pilot seat kind of kill. Beyond that, there's another big beefy outrigger done, so we can actually build out a little bit on the underside, because once the outriggers are on the underside, kind of in the middle here, looks pretty flimsy in comparison. So we can build that out just a little bit, and we'll just do a little bit of tweaking now, kind of get it ready. We'll do a little bit more in the practice map, and then that'll be it for this episode. Next episode, we're going to mount the guns, and we're going to do a bunch of testing, and then we're going to make some tweaks, and then we're going to get it ready for its debut in a match footage episode immediately after, or a day after, however it works out. So now we're just doing a little bit of protection around the mounting blocks for the rotor blades. You can see how this goes together. You'll get a little bit more practice map footage. and then we'll see you in the next episode. So if you want to be notified when I add that next episode, you can always subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on social media for notifications. Links for that are always in the information section below the video. Please leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.